Okay, so you want to own a sober living facility. On paper, it looks like the gentlest business in America. You're in a house. You fill it with people trying to stay clean. You collect rent. It sounds like landlording with a mission attached, the kind of thing you could feel good about at a dinner party. Here's the problem. The version of this business that shows up in the pitch decks, the humble mission-driven version, is not the version that made the most money in this industry over the last 15 years. The version that made the most money figured out something else entirely. That a house full of vulnerable people with health insurance isn't a real estate asset. It's a billing address. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a sober living home turns into one of two completely different businesses. One that quietly compounds on thin margins for a decade, and one that gets its owner a federal indictment. And you'll understand why. In most of this country, nobody's checking which one you're running until it's too late. Let's start with the version that looks like real estate, because that's the version everyone pitches you first. A well-run 8-bed sober living home in a mid-market area can throw off $5,000 to $7,000 a month in net cash flow once it's stabilized, with operating margins in the 20 to 35% range. That's not a bad little business. On a 10-bed house, residents typically pay somewhere between $1,500 and $3,500 a month, which puts a full house at $180,000 to $420,000 a year in gross revenue before you touch expenses. First, the property. You're either leasing a house, the more common route, since it keeps the capital requirement low, or you're buying one, in which case you're underwriting it more like a small multifamily deal than a business. Second, staffing. Most homes run lean here. A house manager, sometimes shared across 2 or 3 properties once you scale. Third, compliance and operations, drug testing supplies, insurance, basic upkeep. Startup costs typically land somewhere between $50,000 and $150,000, covering the property deposit, licensing where it applies, and initial operations. The number that actually decides whether you survive is occupancy, not the sticker price on the room. A 10-resident house charging $900 a month generates about $9,000 in monthly gross revenue. But that number alone tells you nothing about profitability because the cost structure of the home matters just as much. A 10-bed home typically needs something close to 90% occupancy just to break even, and most operators are budgeting for 40 to 60% occupancy in year one. That gap between what you need and what you'll actually get in month one is where most new operators quietly go broke before they ever get a chance to be profitable. The economics improve significantly with scale. Your second and third homes carry almost no incremental administrative overhead because a single house manager can often oversee 2 or 3 nearby properties, and your marketing and referral relationships serve the whole portfolio, not just one house. This is the part that looks exactly like every other roll-up in this series. Mall, hotel, ranch, it doesn't matter. You lose money proving the model on house 1. You make money on houses 4 through 40. That's the legitimate version of this business. Slow, real estate flavored, capped by how many beds you can responsibly fill. Solid, unremarkable, patient capital economics. Which is exactly why it's strange that this is one of the only housing businesses in America where a handful of operators manage to turn a modest rental spread into tens of millions of dollars in a few years flat. To understand how, you have to understand what almost nobody checks before you open the doors. Here's the part that breaks people's brains about this industry. In most of the country, you don't need a license to run one. Only 3 states, New Jersey, Utah, and Arizona, actually require a license to operate a sober living home. Everywhere else, you can open your doors without a state inspector ever setting foot inside. Many states now require or incentivize certification through NARR, the National Alliance for Recovery Residences, if you want access to government referrals and funding, but even that certification is voluntary in most places. Sit with that for a second. This is a business built around one of the most vulnerable populations in the country. People who are, by definition, in a fragile and often desperate moment of their lives. And the barrier to entry is closer to opening a bed and breakfast than it is to opening a licensed clinical facility. Because these are non-clinical recovery residences rather than treatment centers, they typically fall outside the regulatory frameworks that govern actual healthcare providers. That gap exists for a defensible reason. Sober living homes aren't supposed to be medical facilities. They're supposed to be housing, and housing doesn't get regulated like a hospital. But the moment you understand what's sitting one floor above that housing, the insurance-billed treatment services that most residents are also enrolled in, you start to see the shape of the problem. The house itself is unregulated. What happens to the person living in it is billed through a system with almost no ceiling. Two completely different businesses live inside that one address. One of them is a landlord. The other one is something else. And nothing in most state law forces you to tell anyone which one you actually are. Here's what's coming. The mechanism that turned this into one of the most lucrative fraud vehicles in American healthcare. And here's why it matters to you, even if you never intend to touch it. Because it's the reason every legitimate operator in this space now operates under a cloud of suspicion they didn't create. Since 2008, two federal laws changed the math on addiction treatment completely. The Affordable Care Act and the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act require insurers to cover addiction treatment. And critically, there's no annual or lifetime limit on how many times you can go through rehab. Relapse isn't a disqualifying event. It's a billing opportunity. You can go through treatment, relapse, and go through it again, and the insurance company has to pay for it again. Now, put a sober living home next to that law. The home itself doesn't bill insurance. Basic sober living housing typically isn't covered by insurance at all, because it's not a clinical program. But the outpatient treatment center down the street and the lab running the drug tests absolutely do bill insurance. And nothing stops the person who owns the sober home from also owning or quietly controlling the treatment center and the lab. Anyway, here's the number that made this worth doing. Facilities can bill insurers for urine drug testing 2 or 3 times a week per resident, and a single test, depending on the panel, can cost insurers anywhere from $5 to $5,000. Multiply that across a full house, every week for months. One rental property, 10 residents, and a testing schedule aggressive enough to look clinical. That's a revenue engine that has nothing to do with rent. So, before we get into exactly how this got weaponized, if you're finding this rundown useful, subscribing is the easiest way to keep getting the real mechanics behind businesses like this one, instead of the version everyone else is selling you. That's the setup. Here's the tension. And it's the part that turns a housing business into a public health scandal. Once an operator realizes the house isn't the profit center, the testing and treatment billing is, the incentives flip completely. A resident who stays sober and moves out is a resident whose insurance stops paying. A resident who relapses, gets re-enrolled in treatment, and gets tested 3 times a week is a resident who keeps the revenue flowing. The business model that makes the most money is the one where people don't get better. That's not a hypothetical. That's the documented mechanism behind what investigators call the Florida Shuffle. And it's what segment 4 is actually about. The Florida Shuffle was a coordinated fraud model that cycled insured patients through networks of treatment centers, sober homes, and labs, appearing legitimate on the surface while generating millions through medically unnecessary services, kickbacks, and repetitive billing. Federal prosecutions eventually traced more than $100 million to schemes built on exactly this playbook. Here's how it actually worked, step by step. First, the recruitment. So-called body brokers would find people struggling with addiction, often people with strong health insurance, sometimes recruited from out of state, and bring them into the network. Brokers would cover travel costs, offer free or reduced rent, and in some cases even help patients obtain private insurance and pay the premiums themselves, because the premium was a rounding error against what that insurance policy was about to generate in billings. Second, the placement. The broker would move the patient into a sober home tied to a specific treatment center, and the sober homeowner would send the resident to that outpatient center in exchange for a kickback, disguised in court documents as case management fees, consulting fees, marketing fees, or commissions. Third, the extraction. Residents would be sent for drug testing 2 to 3 times a week, sometimes more, ostensibly to confirm they were staying clean, but in the fraudulent operations, many of those tests were never reviewed by a medical professional, and some were billed for services that were never even provided. Fourth, and this is the part that separates fraud from something much darker, the Florida Shuffle actually relies on people staying addicted. As a patient's insurance benefits for one type of care ran out, they'd get moved to a different level of care, and the cycle would restart. A former operator, describing the culture from the inside, put it bluntly, "All of my friends that ran sober homes and treatment facilities believe the only way to compete is to cheat and get paid for patient brokering. Otherwise, you have no business." Recovery stopped the billing. Relapse restarted it. The business model and the health outcome were pointed in opposite directions, and the business model won. The state of Florida noticed. Palm Beach State Attorney Dave Ehrenberg spearheaded a sober homes task force that made 97 arrests between October 2018 and the time of that reporting, with 38 convictions. Ehrenberg's own description of what the shuffle does to a person is the bleakest sentence in this entire industry. It perpetuated an endless cycle of relapses designed to siphon away a person's insurance benefits until that person leaves on a stretcher or a body bag. The romance of the mission is real. The unit economics underneath it are built to punish recovery. Numbers like these stop being abstract once you attach them to the people who actually ran the operation. Take Kenneth Chapman. Chapman and his associates defrauded insurance companies of an estimated $24 million between 2013 and 2016, running sober homes with names like Stayin' Alive and Redemption Sober House. Chapman and his co-defendants gave residents free or reduced rent to keep them enrolled in drug treatment and drug testing that could be billed to their insurance. And, remarkably, they let residents keep using drugs as long as those residents kept attending treatment and kept getting tested. Chapman and his wife lived in a $1 million home and drove high-end cars off the proceeds. Some of the more than 2,000 residents who passed through his facilities died of overdoses. Chapman also forced some of the women in his homes into prostitution, using drugs as leverage and telling them the money would cover their rent. He was sentenced to 27.5 years in prison. Take Carrie Lynn Beadle. Beadle and her co-conspirators billed health insurers for more than $58 million in addiction treatment services that were never provided or medically unnecessary across a treatment center and a linked sober home she operated. The mechanism was the same one you just learned. Recruit patients with kickbacks, free or reduced rent, travel costs, other benefits, in exchange for their agreement to live the sober home, attend treatment, and submit to regular, often unnecessary, drug testing. Take Sebastian Ahmed, who ran a sober home network called Serenity Ranch Recovery. Prosecutors attributed roughly $38 million in fraudulent billing to his clinics between 2016 and 2019, of which insurers actually paid out over $6 million. And of everyone in the conspiracy, Ahmed personally netted more than $2.8 million in under 3 years. 3 operators, 3 different networks. The same underlying business model, run at 3 different scales, and every single one of them ended in federal prison, not because the housing was illegal, but because the billing was. Here's the reframe worth sitting with. None of these men got caught running a bad real estate business. They got caught because the real estate was never the business at all. It was the delivery mechanism for something insurance actuaries never priced correctly. So if that's the version of this business that ends in a courtroom, what is the version that doesn't actually look like? It looks mostly like the opposite of everything you just heard, which is exactly why it makes so much less money and lasts so much longer. Oxford House, founded in 1975, is the largest network of self-run recovery residences in the country. Reportedly more than 3,000 houses, providing housing for around 30,000 people at any given time. There's no house manager, no resident advisor, no counselor on site. Residents govern the house themselves through weekly meetings and majority vote, and anyone who uses drugs or alcohol is expelled immediately by that same vote. Residents split rent, utilities, and household supplies equally, typically $400 to $600 a month. And there are no program fees, no counseling charges, no administrative markup sitting on top. The organization itself is a nonprofit that runs on technical assistance and expansion support, not on ownership of the houses or extraction from the residents living in them. Notice what's missing from that model. No treatment center sitting conveniently next door. No lab contract. No kickback disguised as a consulting fee. Take the insurance billing engine out of the picture entirely, and what's left is exactly what the pitch deck promised in the first place. A modest, decent break even to slightly profitable housing business. The legitimate operators still standing in this industry have converged on the same playbook. Get NARR certified even where it's optional. Keep the housing and the treatment billing at arm's length from each other, often at a legal arm's length, not just an ethical one, and compete on occupancy and reputation instead of on how aggressively you can bill a lab test. It's slower. It tops out around 20 to 35% margins at full occupancy. The same number a good self-storage facility or a decent car wash puts up. Nobody's building a fortune on it in 18 months. That's the actual choice sitting underneath this business, and it's a sharper one than almost anything else in this series. Most industries hide their worst version behind complexity. This one hides it behind a single decision, whether the house makes the money or whether the house is just where you keep the people who do. Underneath every version of this business, the honest one and the fraudulent one, sits the same overlooked asset, the house itself. Whoever owns that property gets paid, whether the operator running it is Oxford House or Kenneth Chapman. That's the part nobody puts in the pitch deck for a sober living facility, because it's not really a sober living story. It's a landlord story wearing a mission statement. And once you start pulling on that thread, who actually owns the dirt underneath every impact business in this country, and what they quietly extract regardless of who's operating on top of it, you start to realize real estate isn't one business. It's the business sitting underneath all the others. That's exactly where we're going next.